Welcome back to another episode of Beats by Jer. I'm your host, Jared Harris. If you're hoping for a poli-sci lecture, I'm sorry to say that you're in the wrong place. Today, we'll be looking at the highly anticipated, the ill-fated 2008 release from Guns N' Roses, Chinese Democracy. Now, it's important to note that Chinese Democracy is a Guns N' Roses album by name only. In so many ways, this feels like an Axl Rose solo album. The band, the mostly original Guns N' Roses, the Use Your Illusion Guns N' Roses, minus founding drummer Steven Adler and rhythm guitarist Izzy Stradlin. Stradlin, of course, really being the soul of the band of the Appetite era. The band had begun working on a new album following their massive Use Your Illusion tour in 1993. Looking at 94, there are countless stories and rumors of the band being involved in the writing of a follow-up GNR record. However, it is extremely questionable to the degree in which Slash, Duff, and the rest of the band at the time were involved. While there were riffs and some loose song ideas, it is uncertain what remained and if something remained, at what point it was brought back, as opposed to what was scrapped entirely. By 1997, Slash, Duff McKagan, drummer Matt Sorum, and guitarist Gilby Clarke would all be removed from Guns N' Roses. While Slash was the first to depart following creative and personal differences with Rose, followed by the firing of hired members Clarke and Sorum, Duff was the last to leave, once again due to issues with Rose. Whether they were working on an entirely different record or a skeleton of what would become Chinese Democracy, or simply songs that were ultimately cut from the record, also remains unknown. Rose claims that everything from this time has been scrapped, while Slash and Duff both claim that nothing had been completed. There was nothing to scrap. With Duff elaborating in his book, It's So Easy and Other Lies, Guns had been paying rent on studios for 3 years now, from 1994 to 1997, and still did not have a single song. The whole operation was so erratic, and it didn't seem to fit with my hopes for parenthood, for stability. Following the collapse of what remained of the original band, all that was left was Rose and keyboard player Dizzy Reed. They looked at a number of prospective artists who were all considered to work on Chinese Democracy, as well as joining the band, even auditioning Black Label Society guitarist, frequent Ozzy Osbourne collaborator, and now of Pantera, Zakk Wylde, Pearl Jam drummer, original Pearl Jam drummer, Dave Abruzzese, and drummer Michael Bland, who had worked with Prince and the New Power Generation era. The first new hire came in the shape of Nine Inch Nails live guitarist Robin Fink, who is criminally underrated as a songwriter and musician. Funny enough, Rose was reportedly becoming obsessed with electronic and industrial music, and specifically wanted to move the band towards the creative direction of Nine Inch Nails. So Fink was a very logical choice moving forward. The 1997 lineup, the lineup that Geffen had hoped would create and release Chinese Democracy for 1999, was filled out by Josh Freese, now of the Foo Fighters, and a session legend, bassist Tommy Stinson of The Replacements, and multi-instrumentalist Chris Pittman, likely on additional keys and guitar. This lineup would not last. And additional session work was completed by an all-star lineup of rock musicians. We're talking Buckethead, who at the time was speculated to actually be Slash in disguise with his white mannequin face mask and his KFC bucket that he wore atop his head, similar to Slash's top hat. Richard Fortus, who remains in the band today, Bumblefoot, and drummers Brian and Frank Farah, again, who remains with the band today. But the album also featured unused contributions from Queen's Brian May and Jane's Addiction and Red Hot Chili Peppers guitarist Dave Navarro. This record holds a special place in popular culture for a number of reasons, and it's one that continues to astound me to this day. Part of this extends from being simply a part of the Guns N' Roses legend itself. This was the follow-up to Use Your Illusion, delivered following a series of delays, rumors, and speculation, along with a revolving door of musicians attached to the project. With time comes hype, but with negative press comes the need for an album's quality to justify scandal. Furthermore, the album cost $13 million to record. $13 million. Take a second. Think about that. This made it the most expensive rock record ever made, and the second most expensive album ever, following Michael Jackson's Invincible, which cost somewhere between 30 to 40 million. While that's a story for another time, to this day, the story of Chinese democracy baffles me. It really is absurd. So let's dig in. Aside from the false start in 93, 94, work on what would become Chinese democracy really began in 1997 with producer Youth joining the team in 98. He would shortly leave the project, citing Rose as not being ready to release a record. Sean Bavan, who had previously worked most famously with 9 Inch Nails and Marilyn Manson, stepped into the production role that year, and by summer 1999 had reportedly recorded over 30 songs with the band, a bulk of which would actually appear on the album nearly a decade later. Rose was reportedly in and out of the studio at this time and completed all his vocal takes within a week at the end of this period. When not present, Rose had the engineering team send him CDs of different songs, arrangements, and mixes that they would record of the rest of the band, right? Listening to them jam, different takes on different songs, different approaches to same songs, different arrangements, mixes of all of these different versions. He would have them send him CDs of all of this, so he can almost be in the studio without being in the studio, I guess. It was recorded that at one point they had sent him a total of 1,000 CDs of these assorted variations of different ideas that would or would not become Chinese democracy. By 1999, there was an official announcement sharing that the title would be Chinese Democracy, but no word on the album date. However, at this point, Rose had sat down with Rolling Stone magazine, giving them a first listen, which led to David Wild comparing the album to Led Zeppelin's Physical Graffiti, only if it had been remixed by both Beck and 9 Inch Nails. Evidently, the Chinese Democracy of 1999 is not the Chinese Democracy of 2008. Without getting into gossipy territory, there is a note that must be added to this narrative, something which makes this more mysterious, but is not necessarily the most accurate detail. Once, in the last 2 years, there was a tab on Axl Rose's Wikipedia page about his disappearance from the public eye. Having since been removed from his page, I could only go off of my memory on this rumored period, but there was something like an 8-year span where no one saw Axl Rose in the late 90s. While the number or extent of this may be exaggerated, his reclusive lifestyle can be credited to multiple sources. This rabbit hole goes even deeper when you consider Axl himself admitting to not writing for years in the 90s following criticism from Slash, Duff, and his ex-fiancée Stephanie Seymour. These things are taken with a heavy grain of salt, and the timelines and the recollections of everyone involved with this album seem murky at best. We're truly in muddy waters here, but it does beg the question, where did you go, Axl, and what did you do exactly? By 2000, the first track, Oh My God, was released on the End of Days soundtrack and sported a heavy industrial sound and featured Dave Navarro on guitar. However, due to panning from critics, the song was quickly forgotten and never appeared anywhere else. Around this time, Fink had left the band to focus on Nine Inch Nails. Band manager Doug Goldstein, in January 2000, made the audacious claim that the album, which had already been delayed, was 98% done and could be released later that year. Around this time, Bevan would depart as producer, and Rose got Queen producer Roy Thomas Baker to step in. Baker felt the industrial sound of the album was not the direction for Guns N' Roses, and this influence needed to be minimized. In fact, he felt most of the record needed to be re-recorded, including all of Freeze's drums, which had especially played in the industrial tone in both what he performed and how they recorded his drum tones. Freeze's work would be re-recorded by Brian Key Mantia, a drummer who simply goes by Brian. While Brian's time in the band would not make it to the release of the album, he, of course, would be replaced by Frank Farah, who is still drumming for Guns N' Roses to this day on this current tour. Things start to get really interesting here. Frank Farah claims to be the only drummer on the title track of Chinese Democracy, and the rest of the album features drums by him and Brian, using Freeze's arrangements as a foundation. However, the nature of this claim leaves me to wonder if other songs featured tracks recorded from each drummer cut and mixed together at different moments. Otherwise, why would Farah claim to be the only drummer on the song Chinese Democracy? It's a strange, I don't know if I'm digging too much into the wording of this, but it sounds almost as if some of Brian and Farah's drum tracks were used side by side on the same songs, as opposed to just appearing on different tracks on the album. On top of this, though, to make the rhythm section feel more cohesive, Stinson re-recorded his bass parts on every new drum track, having expressed that he recorded each song at least 5 or 6 times. By 2001, Jimmy Iovine, head of Interscope Records, who had purchased Geffen, rehired Tom Zutaut as project manager to get it done, even promising him a massive amount of royalties if the record could be completed within a year. Zutaut had, of course, been the A&R guy who signed Guns N' Roses from the very beginning. At this point, there's speculation from different sources that there were 50 to 60 songs, some completed, some in varying stages of existence. As an attempt to keep the peace, to keep things moving, and to keep artists from leaving, he also found the band was renting an obscene amount of gear that wasn't being used. His changes saved the band around $75,000 a month. Zutaut even tried to convince Axl to release Chinese Democracy as a solo album. At one point, Buckethead was thinking of leaving, and Zutaut had convinced him to return by abiding to his request to build a chicken coop within the studio, which only Buckethead and the necessary engineers needed to record him could enter. By late 2002, Dizzy Reed had stated that the album should drop by summer 2003. And around this time, The Offspring sent out a fake press report as a joke, stating that their new album would be called Chinese Democracy, You Snooze, You Lose, which resulted in a cease and desist order from Axl. You cannot make this stuff up. And of course, when thinking about the massive undertaking of re-recording an album, or parts at the very least, things get really interesting on the guitarist front. Fink returned in 2000 after Rose had threatened to have all of his contributions re-recorded, leaving us to believe that Fink's work is abundant across the entire album upon its eventual release. Things still continue to get murkier as they Already have. When looking at Richard Fortus and his involvement, Fortus says that he contributed to the chorus of Better and followed up by saying that a lot of the album's riffs actually go back to Slash's time in the band, which of course contradicts Axl's claim that everything from that time had been scrapped, and doesn't necessarily go against Duff saying that there was no songs. There may have been loose ideas and riffs, but it's very questionable as to where everything came from. Slash, of course, does not, Slash or Duff for that matter, no one from that era of Guns N' Roses has any writing credits on Chinese Democracy aside from Rose and Reed, of course. Furthermore, by the time Bumblefoot joined in 2006, he stated the challenges of adding to the songs, as they were already so densely layered, making it a challenge for his parts to be heard without being buried by other lead lines or without burying others himself. All the while, as all of this is happening, as new members are being brought into the studio, as an album is being recorded and parts are being re-recorded, and as new management is stepping in, it's important to note that 2001 saw the Chinese Democracy World Tour kick off without a Chinese Democracy album to promote. The tour would continue on and off until 2012. Much like the recording process, the tour was an absolute mess. 2001 dates were plagued with no-shows and late appearances from Axl, which resulted in riots. The eventual departure of Buckethead would result in their 2004 tour dates being canceled entirely, leaving the band off the road until 2006. And in 2006, an additional 4 shows would be canceled by Rose, who stated more work needed to be done on the album in which they were touring to promote. But I digress. I feel as though we're getting sidetracked from the timeline from the making of Chinese Democracy. By mid-2003, Rose told a journalist that the band had begun to re-record Chinese Democracy again, making this the 3rd attempt to re-record this album in total. By 2004, Buckethead would be removed from the band, the tour would be canceled, and Stinson was claiming the record would be entering the mastering stages by November. At some point in this year, Geffen and Interscope would withdraw any future funding for the project, saying that due to there being no album after so many years and so many missed deadlines, and the record exceeding all budgets by millions of dollars, all remaining costs would fall to Axl. At one point, the band was operating on a monthly budget of $250,000, with Axl stating that costs would be recouped by the release of multiple albums. By 2006, word was that there was a November release coming. Songs were beginning to leak both online and onto the radio. Axl was hosting listening parties in New York. It looked like it was all ready to go. However, November came and went, and in December, there was finally an official announcement. The first official announcement to actually come from the band's channels rather than an off-the-cuff remark to a journalist, a reporter, an interview. This announcement claimed the release date of March 6, 2007. Around some point in here, Sebastian Bach, formerly of Skid Row, stated that Axl had disclosed to him that Chinese Democracy would be the first in a trilogy of albums. The final vocal sessions wrapped up in January 2007. Funny enough, shortly before the album was wrapped up, Stinson stated that the album was basically done in 2001 and nothing groundbreaking had been added to the songs since then. Over a decade in the works at 15 studios, an abundance of musicians and producers, and an entire process of re-recording the album not once but twice, Chinese Democracy was finally released on November 23rd, 2008. I can't help but feel like Charlie Day in the mailroom, trying to keep track of the album personnel, the dates, the different delays. It's such an undertaking. Where is Pepe Sylvia? To create a succinct timeline of the creation of Chinese democracy is not easy, largely because there is still so much speculation and unknown information, and most of what we know is based off the recollection of different artists, which of course we're at the mercy of their memory and their own timeline, which we know is never something all that reliable. The common theme running through this, confirmed by different producers and musicians attached to the project, was Axl's pursuit of perfection. It was Salvador Dali who stated, "Have no fear of perfection. You'll never reach it." Perfection is one hell of a drug, something that any creative can spend their life chasing. It's a trap and can be ever so confining. In this story, perfection truly is one of the antagonists, something which haunted Axl endlessly as he reshaped his band, re-recorded his album, and spent another $1 million to do it. The launch was met with incredibly mixed results. Despite debuting on the Billboard charts at number 3, the album failed to reach sales expectations in America, despite selling significantly more in the European markets. Furthermore, reviews were all over the place. As time has gone by, however, there has been a growing appreciation for the album, something which I am currently seeing myself. Having recently seen Guns N' Roses earlier this month, I was surprised by how great the title track was. Chinese Democracy. What a song. This pushed me to look back at a record I haven't listened to in well over a decade. In a retrospective from the 2010s, Billboard stated, "The most anticipated rock record in history was murdered by 1,000 different jabs and body shots, including artwork that the artist wasn't committed to, but the colossal marketing blunder was the Tyson-esque knockout punch." With a growing appreciation over the years among the popular consciousness of rock fans, and being far enough from the blast radius of the hype that surrounded this album, it's fair to say that Chinese Democracy was judged for more than just its musical content. I think this is a fair assessment. Listening to the album now, there are moments of true greatness, brilliant writing, explosive riffs, experimentation, and challenging of expectations. But you have to dig for these moments. There's certainly a lot of filler surrounding them. As an album, I still don't think Guns N' Roses stuck the landing, but there is much more to praise than I initially thought. For starters, Chinese Democracy is a banger of an opening song. The riff actually comes from drummer Josh Freese, but what a simple and powerful opener. The political tone on this song also fits Axl really well, and the chorus is an absolute anthem. To me, despite knowing the main riff originated from Freese, this feels like something Slash and Duff would have written for Velvet Revolver, making it essential to the Guns N' Roses canon, which likely explains why it's regularly performed within the band's set since reforming. Immediately following back to back is Shackler's Revenge, another great song, one which demonstrated the industrial influence on Axl's writing, but also the versatility of the industrial genre and how it can be made to fit into a more straightforward hard rock approach. The song is haunting, violently beautiful, and is an incredible display of what the new Guns N' Roses could have been without feeling like they had strayed too far from who they were. The third song on the album, Better, rounds out this three-peat. To be honest, I'm not all that sure how this song holds up without being biased. The drums in the song were mind-blowing when I first heard them at 14 years old. And while I didn't really listen to this record beyond the first couple spins hearing it, this is a song that I would regularly play along to. That tom groove in the chorus with the crashes on the quarter notes, it was awesome. And the way it's mixed so the toms are a little more subtle, almost like they're percussion, and the crash is almost overbearing. It was just such an exciting thing to play along to. The song as a whole is great, but also feels bloated and excessive, like much of the rest of the album. It's definitely the nostalgia talking that makes Better worth mentioning. But Axl has stated that the bridge of the song is his favorite moment on the album. If the world fills this weird void on Bond songs that aren't actually Bond songs, it's got a bit of contemporary pop to its vibe, and it's aided by electronic drums and flamenco guitar. It's a really cool song, and it's something you would never actually expect to come from Axl Rose. It's really just a great song. Later in the record, Sorry is a stunning ballad that is probably the perfect synthesis of electronic pop elements with hard rock. The verse grooves hard on something that could have been the blues, but instead feels nostalgic for Phil Collins or Genesis and that sort of alternative pop of the 70s and 80s. The chorus, on the other hand, rips the soundscape wide open with an incredible riff. The push and pull between these dynamics should have been the starring element for this era of Guns N' Roses, something that would have defined the sound of Chinese democracy. But it seems the rest of the record couldn't quite get out of its own way to deliver on this contrast. That being said, Sorry is absolutely captivating. The final song worth discussing is Madagascar, the opus on the record. Electronic drums, synths, and one of Axl's greatest vocal deliveries ever highlight the verses of this song. The song is subtle in its use of intensity and builds to include live drums and layered guitars, putting this in the pantheon of some of the greatest rock ballads of the last 20 years. The bridge section also features audio samples from films like Mississippi Burning, Casualties of War, Cool Hand Luke, Braveheart, Seven, and these samples are arranged colliding with segments of Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream and Why Jesus Called a Man a Fool speeches. Musically, this lands, and it's a really cool moment that builds the song even higher into the final chorus. However, I can't help but wonder how self-indulgent it is for Axl to put his voice beside that of MLK. Still, there is something really brilliant about Madagascar. Interestingly enough, both Sorry and Madagascar are the only songs to be written entirely by just Rose and Pittman, making the collaboration one of refined genius. Across the album, only one other song, Better, has writing credits to just two artists, Rose and Fink. And This I Love, is the only song on the album written solely by Rose. Out of the 14 songs, 5 are excellent, maybe 6. I can't quite seem to get my bias out of the way for Better, but 5, maybe 6 excellent songs. As an EP, Chinese Democracy could have raised the standards of modern 2000s rock. Instead, the record feels overly excessive without justification. While musically cohesive, there's a lack of chemistry on the album. It's sterile. Guns N' Roses at one point were the most dangerous band in the world, and despite all of the aggression on Chinese Democracy, the record feels conventionally safe. Furthermore, it is hard to determine who played what and what was salvaged between re-recordings and what was re-recorded note for note or was re-recorded and recreated in the style of what preceded. Looking at the track listing on Wikipedia, it looks like nearly every guitarist involved performed on nearly every track, but that goes against the notion of re-recording, unless, of course, pieces were cut from previous mixes and tracks and then pasted into the final version of Chinese Democracy. If you had re-recorded everything, you would only have the last couple of guitarists present on everything. Like I said, the waters get murky. This feels like what has been done. The idea that the re-recording process saw the cutting and pasting of other people's parts into a final, almost Frankenstein-like mix, including the work of so many artists. There's so much guitar lead lines on this album. Endless amounts of sweep picking and shredding solos between vocal lines. It's used as a transition tool. It's underneath everything else, almost everywhere. There's something soulless about it, affirming the idea that some of these pieces were almost plucked from a previous variation of the song and dropped in wherever there was space. It's so jam-packed with these shredding guitars that it feels like there was almost a lack of confidence in the songwriting, something which should not have been the case. For this album, virtuosity on the guitar has overshadowed the songs in a way that is not necessary. The brilliance in songwriting was met with an equal level in tastelessness that kind of just buries the music, buries the song, which is unfortunate. Most importantly, however, this is a major departure for Guns N' Roses, and while I applaud Axl for seeking a new direction and for continuing to innovate the band sound and his voice as a songwriter and the pursuit of creativity, there is something to be said about Chinese Democracy in the context of the band's legacy and previous albums. Looking at the Appetite for Destruction era, while the band was marketed as another LA hard rock hair metal band, an 80s rock band, musically they were almost the antithesis of this. Not quite the antithesis that grunge was to this genre, but they shared the use of loud, distorted guitars and riffs and solos, but they were so apart from this style. The band was, at their core, as much a punk band as they were a 70s blues rock outfit, as close to Motorhead as they were to Aerosmith, Zeppelin and Sabbath to the Stooges and the Germs. The band's sound was driven by a chaotic energy and a use of melody and riffs nostalgic for the early 70s. And they emerged at a point when the 80s hard rock scene was becoming a tired parody of itself, and their sound is what catapulted them to becoming the biggest band in the world in seemingly record time. Their target audience loved them, and to an industry scrambling to find the next wave of rock bands before the 90s would turn this idea all on its head, Guns N' Roses extended that 80s sound purely from a business perspective. They were innovators with a sound unlike that of their peers, and love or hate the Use Your Illusion records, but the same can be said about them, only on a slightly less raw and a significantly more ambitious scale. Despite traces of pop, electronic, and industrial influences and effects, Chinese Democracy plays like a typical hard rock album from the late 2000s. For the first time ever, Guns N' Roses fit in with their contemporaries rather than working against what was expected from a rock band at the time. There is a distinct absence of that bluesy punk sound that made Appetite so intoxicating. And the electronic influences and effects were so sparing and so minimal that to say that the album was inspired to which it was originally, to the degree in which it originally was, is feels shallow when listening to the final recording. Compared to their previous albums, Guns N' Roses is no longer challenging the genre, but following within the style of the day. Falling short of timelessness, Chinese Democracy is very much a product of its time. I don't think any album could have stood up to the immeasurable hype that preceded Chinese Democracy. Had it been released in 1999, perhaps this would have been a very different conversation, and maybe the prospective trilogy would have actually materialized. We'll never know. What leaves me most curious about this is what was created with Slash and Duff before 1997, and how much of that actually influenced the subsequent album. And of course, what of the remaining songs? At one point, there was said to be 40 to 60 songs, depending on who you asked. What of them? How finished are they? And why were they cut? Why didn't they make this album when other songs did? Lastly, there are plenty of stories from different engineers, producers, and musicians about their time working on Chinese Democracy, but the one most silent is the mastermind at the center of it all, Axl Rose. What did he think about the record as he was making it upon its release? How does he regard it now, almost 2 decades later? How does he rationalize spending $13 million on an album that fell far from greatness? And why did he continue to insist upon re-recording through a revolving door of session musicians? These are the thoughts I am left with, and this is why Guns N' Roses' Chinese Democracy is a record that continues to astound me to this day. Next week, tune in for episode number 10, where we'll look at September 24th, 1991, a very special day for new releases and a very special day for a new generation of music. If you like today's episode, follow me on Instagram and TikTok at Beats by Jer. I'm your host, Jared Harris, and this has been Beats by Jer.